Okay, well, sorry. Oh, sorry,
And
Heidi.
I was just going to tell them the title of
Yeah, that's a great idea.
yeah, it is because I want to say this Seminal Confessions Sexual Dreams and Spiritual Diagnosis according to John Cassian. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks everybody for coming. It's really good to see so many of you. Um, yeah, so the handout's titled "So You've Had a Wet Dream," and this is going to be a paper that either speaks very deeply to your experience or not at all. And we'll know very quickly. But it's also a very small glimpse into a much larger project on spiritual direction in early Byzantine monastic texts as a medical art. And so feedback is much appreciated, and excited to hear what you think. So the significance of dreams was, in antiquity, a truth universally acknowledged. Dispute lay in the details. Dreams could be thought to arise from the soul's operations or from their suppression, from divine or daimonic incursions, even from particles striking the body. Across these different ideologies, dreams could tell the future, command an action, offer a prescription, or even for the most skeptical and naturalistic like Aristotle, at least indicate the body's internal state or foretell incipient illness. Christian ascetics participated in these same discourses of dreaming, but evaluated dream sources rather differently, and so found rather different significance in dreams. So Evagrius Ponticus, one of those foremost, most famous ascetic writers, argued that the emotional quality of dream imagery, whether it aroused desire, terror, or self-congratulation, indicated which part of the tripartite soul was malfunctioning, while its clarity indicated how deeply sick the dreamer might be. He makes dreams diagnostic, not of physical ailment, but of psychological, affective, and moral illness. And here we come back to Ellen's earlier question about whether we're talking about medical metaphors or an epistemological conflation or collapse. And I think we'll just kind of carry that question through this study as well. So Evagrius, within that framework, is incredulous of divine dreams. He's quite worried about demonic ones, and he's open to those inspired by angels or by a healthy soul. His ambivalence toward dreams, as well as his reliance on them as a diagnostic indicator, is echoed by writers like Diaticus of Photiki, Mark the Solitary, John of Carpathos, and my favorite, John Climacus. Now, another of Evagrius's disciples, or at least readers, people interested in him and inspired by him, John Cassian, takes a different tack. For Cassian, all dreams are lying images and illusions. Yet he obsessed over a kind that did not interest Evagrius and which was not generally held to be particularly significant: the wet dream. Now, in this essay, we will explore Cassian's incorporation of wet dreams into what we might call a medical framework of spiritual direction. And this framework is laid out both semantically and logically. That is, he uses a lot of medical language to describe it, but also I would say he's doing things in an order and approach that was inspired by medicine, technical medicine. So Cassian himself was a monastic and polemical theologian of the early 5th century, whose life was far more eventful than he would have liked. Now, originally from Dacia, he was tonsured a monk in Syria and later traveled to Egypt with his friend Germanus to visit the holy men of Scetis, Nitria, and elsewhere. Decades later, he distilled his version of Egyptian practices and the Evagrian psychology of the 8 thoughts into his institutes, an instructional and regulative manual aimed at monks in Gaul. Later, still, he reimagined his travels and conversations into a vast and compendious set of 24 conferences, which is where we're going to really be working today. In both collections, though, Cassian rejects the truth of dreams, but raises the issue of wet dreams time and again. He uses them as diagnostic signs to discover the mental and physical habits, the memories and dispositions which lie behind them. Now, admittedly, scholars have spilled a good deal of ink over the spilling of semen in Cassian's writings. I hope that's the worst pun I make today, but I make no promises. But generally, they've either followed Foucault in emphasizing an apparent depth to the monastic self and its shrinkage through obedience, okay, another pun, or they have focused on the consequences wet dreams have for monks' canonical status, that is, can they receive communion? Cassian, though, is only tangentially interested in whether monks take communion, though he thinks they should, if they can. And I think actually Nikki Kazumi Clements has recently critiqued this aspect of Foucault's analysis of Cassian sufficiently. So I'm going to kind of leave both of those aside today, and I'm just going to drill down into what I think is more the medical framework for Cassian's thinking, though I'm, again, happy to talk about it later. So we're going to show how unruly oniric phenomena became part of the diagnosis and therapy of monastic bodies in search of chastity. Now, Cassian develops his singularly dismissive account of dreams using language and resources available from late antique philosophical medical conversations. Particularly relevant are Aristotle's theories and a Galenic treatise on dream diagnosis. In his Parva Naturalia, Aristotle argued that dreams are echoes of sense perception in the imagination, phantasmata, running loose while the common sense is impaired by sleep. Oniric images are susceptible to influence from other pathii, such as anger and love, so that if the soul is already moved by strong emotions, then the movements of lingering perception will be, as it were, colored by them. Angry people dream about violence and lovers dream of their beloved. The phantasmata that beget dreams are, in principle, no different from those that fill the memory, though their arousal differs. Whereas memories are at least usually voluntary, recalled through a process that moves by inference, dreams come when the intellectual faculty is at rest. They are produced by sense perception's lingering effects in the soul and are, if anything, more physiologically determined than memories. Thus, Aristotle flatly denies any divine origin to dreams, but freely admits that they may indicate present or incipient somatic states. Now, much later, and there's a lot in between that I'm going to skip for time, but you have a bit more in your handout on pages 2 and 3 of, especially page 2, Theories of Dream Origins. Galen, or a later editor offering an epitome of the Galenic view of dreams, most likely, also equates dreams, enhypnia, with mental images, phantasiae. However, here, Galen, or pseudo-Galen, differs from Aristotle in 2 ways: dream source and dream production. As to source, he allows 4 possibilities. They reflect bodily dispositions, diatheses. They come from, quote, what we continually do during the day, or what we have thought about, or they show something prophetically. The latter may be divine or daimonic in origin, but Galen describes production of the first 3 categories, that is the bodily or the mental or the memorial. Thus, he says, it is probable that during sleep, the soul descends into the depths of the body and, being withdrawn from external objects of sense, perceives in accordance with the body's disposition, diathesis. While of all things it desires, it has an image of them as though it already obtained them. In Freudian terms, dreams are wishes fulfilled. Now, the description of the soul here recalls the Hippocratic on regimen 4 on dreams, but instead of that treatise's circuits of flesh in the microcosmic world, Galen refers us to disposition, by which he intends the body's humoral balance. It's crassus. Whatever is not simply wish fulfillment in dreams results from the latter, and this explains their diagnostic significance. He says, what sick people see and seem to do in dreams often reveals to us the lack, the excess, and the quality of the humors. Now, physicians of late antiquity follow texts like this, as well as very similar sentiments in Rufus of Ephesus's Medical Questions, in correlating dream imagery, especially color, with humoral dispositions. Medical usage codes the seemingly liminal and unruly psychic phenomena of dreams to the stable map of a medical subject. And I hear now echoes of Chris's paper. The challenge, signaled already, lies in disambiguating the sources and therefore whether and how a dream is diagnostically significant. Now, closely allied to the question of dreams were those surrounding seminal emissions, and the medical literature expounds the theories of their origin and very commonly their prevention. Late antique doctors generally discuss these in the same sections as they discuss priapism, satyriasis, and other matters of sexual behavior or bodily resistance to socially derived norms of sexual behavior. Sex was an activity over which, or about which the ancients had lots of feelings, none of which are divorceable from the assumptions or positions they held or thought they held or the genders they intended to perform. But within these constraints, medical literature generally seeks a physiological cause and response to bodily phenomena. To the extent that seminal emissions concern physicians, it is more the loss of vital spirit, the pneuma psychikon, in semen that most worries them. The dreams that accompany ejaculation are interesting only as ancillary to the emission itself, and even then they're pretty rarely discussed. So whence arise nocturnal emissions? And here I think also page 2 of your handout, if you like. Caelius Aurelianus, through whose work scholars have generally approached Cassian's medical language, discusses seminal emissions, seminis lapsus, in context of somni venerii, sexual dreams, by which he translates the Greek term oneurogmos, which does not mean sexual dream. He argues that the somnus venereus is a name, quote, taken from the symptom, the phenomenon, insofar as the dream by its provoking it leads to a sexual outcome. That is, Caelius's account anchors nocturnal emissions in sexual dreams. They are accompanied always by what he calls visa venerea, sexual sights. In terms of dream production, Caelius seems to follow a basically Aristotelian model. He says that sick individuals suffering from somni venerii ought, quote, first and foremost, to shift mental images from the ideal of sexual intercourse, and having turned to external considerations, to imply them instead elsewhere. Since the sick easily cultivate, by corresponding movements, the impressions they receive while awake in dream images toward actions, it's a fun bit of syntax, and therefore their body is troubled by the shaking of semen. Dreams consist then in mental images lingering over from waking meditations. If someone thinks much about sex during the day, especially if they're sick, they're likely to dream about it at night and likely to finish the deed in thought. Now, other physicians, though, suggest that causation works in an opposite direction. Most remedies for nocturnal emissions rely less on alteration to mental habits than dietetic and even pharmacological interventions. Rufus of Ephesus states flatly that, quote, the ejaculatory dream is set in motion by the heat of the genitals, end quote. Certainly, it's wise to avoid sexual thoughts, he says, but end seminal emissions without also lying on one's side, without fasting before bed, without a drier and colder diet devoid of phlegmatic and flatulent foods. One finds similar dietetic and pharmacological advice across late antique medical literature, including the famous application of lead plates. I keep wanting to say lead pipes to the genitals, but that sounds worse. Lead plates. Popular, mentioned by Cassian, although also rejected by Cassian for reasons we can come back to. One does not, however, find much on mental habits beyond the bare suggestion just to avoid sexual thoughts. Now, the range of therapeutic techniques shows quite clearly that physicians, including the Christian ones later, because they just repeat the same therapies, thought about sexual dreams and seminal emissions in terms of humoral imbalance and seminal production. Their concern was with suppressing the emission of semen because that weakens the body or because an increase in emissions may portend melancholia or mania. The dreams themselves are irrelevant. Thus, in a statement that Christian physicians and dream interpreters could easily echo, Galen says simply, men full of semen dream of sex. Now, if we turn this lens on Cassian, somebody should be clocking how many times I've said semen in this paper, because it's beginning to worry me. A lot, yeah, it's a lot. Turning this lens on Cassian, we can see how indebted he is to these theories and therapeutic discussions, but we can also glimpse how much his theological commitments require their modification. Though his interest in sexual dreams spans the entirety of his monastic writings, we're going to read retrospectively, beginning with the end, with the 22nd conference of Abba Theonas on seminal emissions. And here, Cassian begins at the end. When monks awake to find themselves splattered with an emission of natural fluids, imorum naturalium egestione respersos. Monks' experience of sexual dreams is ineluctably bodily, retrospective, and begins with a physical residue and the revulsion it inspires. While Theonas does speak once of humoris naturalis, he also, like Abba Chiramon in the 12th Conference on Chastity, more frequently calls semen the obscenus liquor or the obscenus humor, the vile and disgusting liquid. And Cassian often refers to its emission as a conluio, as sewage. But the emissions themselves, distasteful though they clearly are to him, or no, not conluio, I'm sorry, conluium. Anyway, as distasteful though they are, they don't belong to the realm of moral responsibility. Cassian is certain that emissions will take place in most adult males, whatever their level of chastity or integrity. their physical regimen, and their mental habit. The emission's inescapable reality, however, cues self-reflection through self-disclosure. As Cassian says, a sexual illusio, an illusory dream, is an indicative sign of sinful desire hidden deep within a person. It is an indicium. These signs are to be read by the elders of the monastic community, whom Cassian describes as spiritual physicians, spiritualis medici, who can, thanks to long experience, diagnose causes and prescribe medical advice, medicabile consilium, and therapies, remedia, to dreamers. So, Cassian, in the person of Abba Theonas, suggests that this is done by discerning the three possible sources of nocturnal emissions and the dreams behind them. He says this disturbance has a triple cause. Either an overflow builds up from excess of foods, or it escapes through carelessness of mind, or it is provoked by our mocking enemy's ambushes. The first cause is bodily, the second mental, the third demonic, no longer daimonic. Theonos will then explain that if the emission is suffered due to a bodily or mental cause, it's culpable. If due to a demonic attack, not culpable. He provides the following criteria for determining if emission is demonic in origin. He says, our enemy pollutes us without any fleshly itching or mental consent, and not through an illusion of some mental image, but by a simple emission of that fluid. That is to say, one can blame demons only when the emission is dreamless, something not envisioned by Kailas and other physicians. And only in similar circumstances could it be called a simple bodily movement and nothing more. This is something unforeseen by other physicians, but demanded, I think, by Cassian's and before him Evagrius's demonology. Now, when dreams do accompany emissions, the production of images correlates to the monk's morally and spiritually judicable behavior. As to the first cause, the excess of fluids that accrues not only necessitates an emission, but an image. So in the second conference, Abba Moses explains that proper fasting prevents a buildup of fluid, which would otherwise accrue and be emitted due to what he calls a natural law of the body. But this natural law has mental effects, since, as Theonos remarks, when there is no repletion in the matter of eating, and ejaculation, and so also an illusion, an illusio, will disturb sleepers more infrequently and not so strongly, because an emission does not so much come from the imagination, the imaginatio, as the imagination comes from an excess of fluid. Cassian merely repeats Galenic medical wisdom in claiming that bodily states influence mental ones, and that an imbalance, in this case an excess of humoris, can set the imaginatio into motion and create illusiones, even as it spurs emissions. But this physical cause has an equally physical, and in Cassian's text, morally inflected therapy in a modified regimen of fasting. The second cause is mental carelessness, which is a bit more problematic. Theonos explains that through negligentia, not only does the multiform wandering of thoughts, something that Cassian worries about very much, break impudently and frivolously into the mind's inmost place, but also the seeds of all one's former passions remain in the mind. So long, he continues, as those seeds remain, tantalizing mental images will persist along with nocturnal emissions. Such emissions are accompanied by dreams whose source then lies in the memory. And here we're back with Aristotle, but in a new and problematic way. In the 12th conference, Abba Kairamon says of such tantalizing illusions that each person is tempted, even while asleep, according to how he behaves and thinks while awake. Sexual dreams take shape according to the thoughts that a monk has previously entertained, whether that day or even longer before. And even these monks who were once married have what Cassian says are filthier and more vivid dreams than virgin monks, but even the latter have considered sexual acts, and so their dreams are as hazy as their conceptions. When it is a matter of memory, then, Cassian prescribes a mental diet of meditatio on scripture and psalm-based prayer to be digested, his metaphor, in the memory, an analog to the regimen of fasting. But of course, the beginning of all this remains the distasteful reality of ejaculation, through which the body confesses for the dreamer and forces him to confront the experience that lies behind it. Unlike Evagrius, who approaches dreams by disambiguating their imagery, Cassian is concerned with disambiguating their physical residue. Unlike physicians, he is not interested in suppressing the ejaculation. In fact, he rejects the notion of lead plates because they wouldn't cure the cause, but rather encountering in encountering the cause through an analysis of the experience of dream. Wet dreams implicate the soul's interdependence with the body, and this psychophysiological framework enables Cassian to make them a diagnostic tool for accessing mental and physical habits which otherwise lie hidden in the past, and for turning monks to appropriate therapies in the future. Yet, for Cassian, nocturnal emissions are not something sloughed off as monks attain to purity of heart. They are an inescapable fact of embodied existence. Thus, he adduces a fourth cause, one I have not mentioned, pride. Some monks begin to believe that they have shed their flesh and its laws. These monks can be sure of a wet dream to remind them that they still bear a body. The only cure then is humility and the acceptance that it is not by effort and desire alone, but always, and this is very important to Cassian, by the grace of God that the monk can attain to chastity. And chastity is always and necessarily deficient precisely by the measure of semen lost in wet dreams. For Cassian, these mark the frontiers of will and desire and call for disclosure, for diagnosis, and for therapy within the hierarchical relationships of a monastic community. Thank you.